What is up guys, it's Troy at the Full Setup back with another benchmark review, and for today's video we have the brand new Ryzen 3 3300X paired with the 6GB RTX 2060. For this review I will be testing a whopping 27 games at 1080p with a mix of low, medium and ultra settings. We will also be testing both the 3300X and RTX 2060 at stocked and overclock settings to see if we can squeeze some more frames out of today's test system. Now before we start with the review, I want to say a huge thanks to today's sponsor, Skillshare. Now I am someone that truly believes you are never too young, old or busy to learn a new skill. Whether it's perfecting your latest hobby or learning new skills for your dream job, I truly believe if you want something from life, it's only yourself that's stopping you from getting it. Now Skillshare features over 20,000 classes and a community of millions of inspiring creatives and learners. Honestly, if you want to learn something, you can almost guarantee Skillshare has a class for you. And as someone that has now been using Skillshare for over a year, trust me when I say a new creative challenge or productivity class will certainly help you fulfill a sense of accomplishment. Now as you all know, I've just finished building a new YouTube studio, and Jordi Vanderput's introduction to studio lighting and DSLR filmmaking have really helped me up the production value of my work. Honestly, I'm just super happy to have this whole new setup, and all the things I've learned on Skillshare over the last year, they're all getting put to use. Honestly, I think you will all love what Skillshare has to offer, and they have kindly offered for the first 1,000 people to join via the link in the description below 2 free months to their premium membership. This gets you access to all their classes, mobile downloads, and for many of their classes, project files to work along with your presenter. After your 2 months has ended, Skillshare offers fantastic deals on their premium memberships, with annual subscriptions costing less than $10 a month. As for the test system, I am using the Ryzen 3 3300X, which has an all-core boost of 4.3 GHz, although mine seems to be boosting an extra 50 MHz. I'm pairing the CPU with an Asus X470 Prime motherboard. As for RAM, I'm using the same 16GB of Team Dark Pro from all my previous Ryzen benchmarks. Now this RAM is rated at 3600 MHz, but I have set the RAM to 3200 today, as I know that's the speed that most of you will be pairing with the 3300X. That being said, I am running this entire benchmark with some pretty tight CL14 manual sub-timings. As for the RTX 2060, I'm using the Asus Dual with 6GB of GDDR6. Now this 2060 has a boost rating of 1725 MHz, but as you can see here on screen, if you keep your card under 65 degrees, the max stock boost rating is much higher. Now to check out the full specification list of this system, you can find it in the description. There's also a link to a video of the build of the system that you're seeing today that I uploaded a couple of weeks ago, so make sure you go and check that video out as well. So let's start by looking at some stock versus overclock performance. Now the first thing, the GPU overclocking, I definitely recommend. That is something that is pretty easy to do. The CPU overclocking is something that you might not be able to achieve at home, or well, it's just something that I don't really recommend, but we've got a big cooler on the system, so I'm going to do it anyway. So starting off with the GPU, then you want to max out the power limit, temperature and power limit, using Msi Afterburner or any other GPU overclocking program that you like to use. I just prefer Afterburner because we get the nice overlay. So you max out the power limit. Now as for a core overclock, depends on what sort of model you've got. If you've got a model which is slightly clocked down and a non-OC edition, you'll probably be able to push about 150 MHz on the core. I've gone for 100 MHz today because I always like to overclock something that you would be able to try at home. Even though the CPU benchmark I said no, but still 100 MHz to the core. Now as for the memory, GDDR6 can overclock a lot more than previous GDDR5. So we have set that to 1000 MHz on the overclock for the GPU. For the memory, now that will result in us having memory running at 16 gigabits per second. Moving over to the CPU then, the thing that I didn't recommend you do at home. Now obviously you can do a bit of overclocking at home. You can push between about 50 and 100 MHz. You know, that's it. There is no real headroom in overclocking Ryzen, especially with the stock cooler. Or if you were to buy just a sort of cheap box cooler between 20 and 30 pounds, I don't even recommend that. You know, you're better off spending that money on better memory, especially if you're buying the system from scratch. Spend that money on better memory. But I already have the Samsung B-Die memory, and I have that big chunky cooler that Arctic sent over, so I thought this isn't a very expensive processor, I'm just going to dump loads of voltage for it. So I put 1.45 volts for it, and I was able to get to 4.6 gigahertz. I was able to pass a test run in Cinebench with that. It scored 2,750-ish points, was roughly what it was scoring after a few passes, but it didn't run on all the games, and I didn't want to put any more voltage through than that because I actually did those benchmarks before I got the rest of the benchmarks, and I didn't want to blow it up. So I dropped it down to 4.55 gigahertz. That got me just over 2,700 in Cinebench when I'm not recording the screen, and that is what we're going to look at for the benchmarks today as well. So it's a 200 megahertz overclock, but for most of you it's about a 250 megahertz overclock because your CPU is only going to boost to 4.3 gigahertz anyway. Starting off with Civ 6 at high settings. Now on this, we're just looking at the turn base. We're just going to look at the sort of CPU benchmark on this. So with the system running at stock with the 3300X and the RTX 2060, both at stock, we have an average turn time of 6.87 seconds. Now, when we overclock the entire system, we have an average turn time of 6.56 seconds. So not really much of an improvement there. And that's one thing you're going to learn from this benchmark, that when you've got a lower end graphics card, there isn't a whole lot to gain from overclocking, especially on the CPU side. So for World War Z, we're running at ultra settings and we're using the Vulkan API. Now for the 3300X at stock, CPU and the GPU also at stock, we have a 1% low of 113 frames per second and an average of 139 frames per second. Now leaving the CPU at stock but overclocking the GPU, we have 1% lows of 121 and an average of 151 frames per second. Running the whole system overclocked, we have a 1% low of 124 and an average of 153 frames per second. Also good for me to mention as well, all the scores were taken when not recording. All of the benchmark scores have been taken when not recording via Shadow Play. Moving on to Far Cry New Dawn then, again at ultra settings. For the whole system at stock, we have 1% lows of 58 and an average of 86 frames per second. Running the CPU at stock but overclocking the GPU results in little gains with 1% low of 61 frames per second and averages of 88 frames per second. With the whole system overclocked, we know Far Cry does like a CPU overclock. We have 1% lows of 71 and an average of 97 frames per second. So that's 11 frames per second faster than stock with the whole system overclocked. That's about as good as it gets. Actually, Wolfenstein's okay. Let's have a look at Wolfenstein Youngblood. We are running at ultra settings, but we have DLSS turned on. So for the whole system at stock, we have 1% lows of 146 frames per second, which is just crazy mad. And then we have an average of 186 frames per second. For the CPU stock, but with the GPU overclocked, we have 1% lows of 156 and averages of 200 frames per second. Now with the whole system overclocked, we do not get any improvements. The 1% lows are a little bit higher at 158 frames per second, but the averages are staying at 200. So obviously the biggest improvements you're gonna find is from the GPU overclocking, not the CPU overclocking there. Moving on to Shadow of War, again at ultra settings. For the whole system stock, we have 1% lows of 66 frames per second and an average of 97 frames per second. Leaving the CPU stock but overclocking the GPU gives us 1% lows of 71 and an average of 105 frames per second. Now overclocking the whole system results in 1% lows of 72 frames per second and an average of 107 frames per second. So that's 10 FPS gain over stock, but again, only 2 FPS gain from overclocking that CPU. Really not worth it. Don't do the voltage, buy the fast memory. Anyway, moving over to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now we're running at ultra, but I decided to turn DLSS on, but I don't think it really makes any improvement at 1080p over running with something like TAA. I think that's the one that it uses. Anyway, now with the whole system at stock, we have a 95% at 86 frames per second, an average of 97 frames per second. Now overclocking the GPU, we have a 95% of 93 frames per second and an average of 104 frames per second. Overclocking the entire system gives us 95% of 94 and an average of 106. So that's almost 10 FPS over complete stock. But again, only 2 FPS more than just leaving the CPU at stock. You know, we're just doing the same thing over and over again here. Don't overclock your CPU, not worth it. Not worth it for Ryzen. Moving over to Gears of War 5 at ultra settings. For all stock, we have 1% lows of 63 frames per second and averages of 83 frames per second. Leaving the CPU at stock but overclocking the GPU gives 1% lows of 65 frames per second and averages of 90 frames per second. With the whole system overclocked, we get 1% lows of 69 and an average of 92 frames per second. And finally, Forza Horizon 4. For all stock, we get 1% lows of 104 and averages of 131 frames per second. For stock with the GPU overclock, we get 1% lows of 109 and an average of 136 frames per second. With the whole system overclocked, we get 1% lows of 109 again, so exactly the same as it was at stock, and we get averages of 138, a 2 FPS gain there. Right then, for the rest of the benchmark, we will just focus on my gameplay footage, my terrible gameplay footage. You're gonna really cringe watching me play Battle Royale. I said that the last time, it's not really making up for it. Why have you not got better since the last video, Troy? Because I make videos all the time and I don't get time to game. That's why. I don't like Battle Royale. Let's not get into that. But anyway, for the rest of the video, you're just going to watch gameplay footage, but you're going to notice that the GPU is still overclocked. As I say in all of these videos, it's because I use Nvidia Shadow to record. So we know we're going to gain about 5 or 10 FPS from overclocking the GPU. We're also going to lose that same amount from recording the screen footage. So what you're actually seeing here on screen now is much closer to stock. There should be a little comment popping up on screen on when I'm going to do my outro. So that will be sort of all the pros and cons of this CPU. Should you buy one? Should you buy the 3100 over the 3300X? You know, all those sort of things, and sort of how much I've enjoyed it, any issues I came into, and sort of any of the games that I didn't think ran as well as they should have ran.
Enemies over there!
Next objective located.
Vendor here if you need equipment. Fire! Grenade out! I'm hit! Contact!
Enemy dropping into the AR.
I'm hit.
Hostiles in the area. Over there. Let's go. I've got you! I'm hit!
My ankle is making this weird. Hostile under us.
Keep firing! Taking aim! How can we win? Assault him!
Take her and go. I'll lead them away.
Buster, no!
You see that? Incoming! Yes. He's dodging. Move up! Can't top my skill. Launching it. All right, let's end it. I see you. Time to end this.
Close. That was your fault.
Fine woods. Uncomfortable for company. Forget the rest. Go with the lead.
Ranger. Heaven.
Quadruple kill.
I'm just getting started.
Team kill.
I have spotted
See through the dragon's eyes.
Step Rider.
Triple kill. Team kill. Double shots find them.
I'm overloading!
Double opening a path. Always leave yourself a backstory.
These Red Legion are well trained, but we are better. We will hold this line until the last civilian is safely away. Incoming! Go back to my team! Don't let them pass the gate. The evac shuttles are back there.
Gracias. I'll defend that area over there. I can probably get there faster anyway. Ha! Hitting the eject button. Ready, set, go!
Spotted. Double timing it. Rings next. Eating lead. Up in the chimney. Reloading. I'm hit. Reloading. I lose my teammate's banner. Jump drive in position. Tango down. Giving him the shimmy. Give me a sec. Recharging shield. I need help. Enemy spotted. Enemy down. Reloading. Fire. Tango down.
I love it, that ain't.
Here you come! Yeah, I could use the practice. Mediocre.
Drilling has started. You must now defend the drill from waves of hostile attacks, or the drill will be destroyed. Warning, a rival is targeting you.
I got points. Go in.
Heads up, grenade!
Starting sweep.
Sentry mode activated.
So these stray mutts form packs. They're gaunt, guts stuck to their spines, covered in scabies, but they just won't die. Because they're clever. Too late. Attacked another one.
So there was the review then, and as you can see, the 3300X performs really good for its price. Really good for its price. I do think it's a little bit price inflated. I feel that once the new Intel 10th generation i3s come out, we will see the price go down just a touch. I paid £115 for my one, but I've seen places selling them to up to 140, which is way too much. I do feel that in a few months we'll see it come down to around the 100, maybe even the £90. And then I'd like to see the 3100 sell for probably, it needs to almost be £30 less. I think the 3100 for like 70, £80, £70 in a sale, you got yourself a really good CPU there. And that's probably the first thing we need to talk about really, isn't it? The 3100 versus the 3300X, and which you should buy. And I think I've pretty much just summed it up there. The price difference just isn't enough. You know, it's only a £15 from the retailer I bought it from. The 3100 was £100 and the 3300X was 115. And even if they perform the same clock for clock, because we know they don't, because the 3100, if you don't know this, it's set across 2 of the CCXs, as in the 3300X, all 4 of its cores on the same CCX. So that's going to give us better latency, and that's going to give us better gaming performance. So with that £15 price difference, there's no point. There's no point buying the 3100 at the moment, because you would have to buy a cooler. Even if there was that £30 that I just said that I wanted, the £30 price difference, you would still have to buy a cooler. You can do a little bit of overclocking with that stock cooler. You could maybe push the 3100, because the non-X's generally take more voltage to get up to the clocks because they're not binned as well. So that 3100, you know, you're probably only going to get to 4.1, 4.2 with that stock cooler. I know there's people out there going to say, oh, I can do 4.4 gigahertz with it, but you know, not everybody wants to run at the same temperatures that you do, alright? Not everybody wants to run their CPU in the high 80s, even though you can. You certainly can. Do not panic about that. But it's not worth it. The 3100 for me, it just feels a little bit dead on arrival. But, you know, if you were on a tightest budget where every single penny of your system matters and you're trying to get extra, you know, a little bit more cash for a bigger SSD or the next jump up in graphics card, you're not actually going to notice the big difference between the 3100 and the 3300X as some of the larger reviewers have been showing. I don't want to criticize any of their work because, you know, they're people I look up to and aspire to be. But the one thing you have to remember is when a new CPU comes out, reviewers will test it with the best graphics card available at the time. So that's a 2080 Ti. And that's where you will see that difference, where you will see a 15% difference in games because you have the higher clock speed and you have that it's on a different, you know, it's a better CCX layout. When you start to actually come down the GPU stack, you know, when you start to go 5700 and under is when that gap really closes up. The 3300X, you maybe might see a 5 FPS boost in certain games, and then you lower down again, so you get to your sort of 1660 levels, RX 580s, even the older 1060s. Those cards, you're not going to see the difference. Okay, you won't see a difference in performance. That being said though, there were a few games that didn't perform as well as I would have liked to. So for some reason, I don't know if this is actually the CPU. I've got a feeling it might not be. It might have just been something else going on with my system. But Borderlands 3 didn't like to play on Ultra. As soon as I put it onto high, it became a much smoother experience, even though the frame rates weren't much different. So I don't know if there's a setting in there that's maybe a little bit too taxing on the CPU. Assassin's Creed, we know, is very CPU heavy, and it didn't feel as smooth as even my older Ryzen 2600 CPU running it on. There was the occasional stutter, and I know what we're going on here. When you mention the word stutter, everybody panics, everybody goes crazy, and the odd little stutter, like you would have seen in Fortnite on low when I was watching the footage back, it's just one little stutter in it. That's not ruining the gameplay. That's just not ideal. But what is annoying is when you've got an absolute stutter fest, when you're getting stutter after stutter, and I know that I'm going mad on the S's here, and it's probably doing your head in, but that's where it's not good, and especially in a multiplayer environment. And that's why I couldn't recommend the Ryzen 3, the 2200Gs, the 3200Gs, processors like that. I've gotten a lot of arguments with people on YouTube about it, because a lot of people ask me all the time, like, what would be the best GPU they would pair with that quad core? You know, will it bottleneck a 1060 or a 580? That's a question I got asked a lot, you know, as those CPUs launched and when those GPUs were the mid-range GPUs. And I always just went around and said, yeah, we'll bottleneck it. You know, I said in demanding games it will bottleneck. I did not enjoy playing Battlefield on a 2200G. In fact, I hated it. I hated making those benchmarks. And then I'll get people making me sound elitist. And, you know, maybe it's because I play Battlefield more than any other game and the game doesn't run well on the CPU. I may well call it trash or roast it a little bit more than I should. But, you know, of course that CPU does perform well. You know, 2200G with like esports titles, and that will max out your graphics cards, your 1060s, even up to a 2060 on esports games. It will do a very good job at maxing it out. But this CPU is a whole different kettle of fish compared to those older ones. But obviously, you know, it's running on the Ryzen 3000 cores that we know perform really well, and it's got the 4 extra threads, and it just absolutely massively makes a difference. Like, again, there was the odd little stutter bit in Battlefield, but that is when you were in a really intensive area. But I enjoyed playing it. I didn't feel like I was pining out for my 3600, especially with a GPU like the 2060. And even at the lower settings, I didn't feel like I had got a lesser CPU in the system. I just didn't feel like I'd taken a step backwards. And that's the thing with me as well. That's one thing I'm probably going to have to go into as well. You'll see in some footage on here, I will always include a stutter, okay? I will always show some of the bad footage. I don't want to just show the smooth footage. I could easily, on these benchmarks, I could easily go and stand on the outside of a big, heavy multiplayer map where there's nothing going on, where you're going to get loads of frame rate and tell you all that's what you're going to get at home. But that's not me. I like to show the rough with the smooth. I feel we're waffling on. What's next on the subject? I've tried to even write a little Word document of just where I'm supposed to go to and how long I'm supposed to waffle for. So yeah, games that didn't perform very well, covered that one. Definitely buy this over a 3100 until that is that price difference. You could say that the 3300X is more future proof, but we know games are getting more demanding. The next consoles are going to be using 8-core Zen CPUs as well, so a lot of the ports are going to be more optimized for higher core counts. So I do believe this processor will show its age quicker. You know, it will show its age in a couple of years. I do believe that it will show its age more than, say, a 2600 or a 3600, because, you know, it hasn't got as many cores. But it'd be a great placeholder CPU. It could be a great placeholder CPU if you were maybe thinking that you wanted all these extra cores, but couldn't afford maybe like a 3700X or even a 3900X. So you were going to settle with a 3600. I would buy this over it if those are the CPUs that you really want, because as Ryzen 4000 comes out, we know AMD heavily discount the CPUs. You could pick up a 27X or 2700X for about £150. I think they're mostly sold out now, but you know, if that happens again, getting a 3700X for 150 or even a 3900X for just over 200 is a big deal. This CPU is no slouch either, and it's no slouch because of some great tech by Nvidia. As you'll notice there, I didn't test any ray tracing because I've done ray tracing before on this card. I haven't been massively impressed with it yet. I do believe it's the future. Again, with the next generation of consoles having it, I feel we'll see a lot more games with ray tracing, but the ray tracing performance of the 2060 is not very good. But I do like a lot of the other RTX features, and they are features that have definitely made this system feel like it's performing a lot better. So the first one is the one I always bang on about. So it has its the Turing, is it the Turing HVenc encoder in it. So you can use this to live stream and not affect the CPU really. So you can use its encoder, which is on par with OBS CPU encoding. So pretty much the gameplay performance that you're seeing right now, if you ran these settings and you didn't have loads of overlays on your stream, you'd be getting pretty much to the same performance as this that you are seeing on screen right now with the same picture quality. That's massive. It's a game changer for me, and I bang on about it in every one of my videos, and I feel like this is where we're going to talk about why to buy an AMD CPU but not to buy an AMD GPU. So that's a huge feature for me. Also got the RTX voice as well, which is great for cutting out the background noise. This is a dynamic microphone, so I don't need to use it, but you would have another 10% performance hit from that as well. And finally, to get me back to my actual point, I said ages ago about this CPU being no slouch. I only actually have one AMD system at Jenner's at the moment. The rest of my systems are all at home. So the system the 3300X in is my editing rig. Adobe have recently updated their hardware encoding to not just support Intel graphics, but also to support AMD and Nvidia. I don't know how AMD performs, but as we know with Adobe, it's far more heavily optimized to run with, you know, Nvidia graphics cards. I might be wrong. AMD cards might perform better at this task, But what you're seeing on screen here, this is a 15-minute 4K video that features lots of 4K 30 footage and 4K 60 footage. It's all being color graded. I've enabled hardware encoding, and the thing rendered in like under 10 minutes. Like on a quad core, I'm telling you, that hardware acceleration is a beast. So if you were thinking you wanted that 3600, but you didn't really want it, but you just wanted those extra cores over this because you wanted a bigger CPU, maybe in 6 months or a year, buy the 3300X. Don't even bother with the 3600. The 3600 is a great CPU, but yeah, I hope that makes sense. That hardware encoding, honestly, I was dreading having to do editing on this, because I know this CPU is going to be in the system for another month or two, because I've got some more graphics cards to review, and it's been fine. And even the whole editing, Premiere is run absolutely fine, Adobe Audition absolutely fine, anything I've chucked at it is run absolutely fine. £115 CPU, really impressed with it, but I would definitely like to see it get a bit cheaper in a few months. I think at like between £90. Absolutely banging, absolutely banging. I think you'd really like it. Don't overpay for one. Don't pay more than the 115 I did. I think Overclockers had it for almost 150 or 160 because they were the first place to get it. Scammers, Overclockers, scammers. Anyway, that's it from me today. Definitely make sure you go and check out Skillshare. If you like the video, leave a like. If you dislike the video, well, leave a dislike then. And make sure you subscribe.